The year was 1598, and Russia trembled at the edge of an abyss. For decades, the land had been ruled by the fearsome hand of Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. He was a man of contradictions, at times brilliant, at times monstrous. He built, destroyed, prayed, and murdered with equal intensity. His reign left Russia larger, yet scarred. When Ivan died in 1584, he left behind 3 sons. The first, Ivan Ivanovich, had been killed by his own father's hand in a fit of rage. The second, Fifer I, gentle and pious, took the throne. But Fifer was not a ruler of strength. He prayed, he fasted, he built churches, but he did not govern. Behind him stood the real power, his brother-in-law Boris Godunov. And when Fifer died childless in 1598, the direct line of the Romanov Dynasty, the family that had ruled Russia for centuries, was broken. The crown was empty, the people were anxious, and Boris Godunov stepped forward. But his claim was weak. He was not of royal blood. He was a boyar, a noble, clever, and ambitious, but to many he was an upstart, a usurper. The seeds of chaos were planted in the soil of Russia. At first, Boris governed wisely. He sought to strengthen the state, improve justice, even introduce learning from the West. Yet his rule was haunted from the beginning. Whispers spread that Boris had murdered the young Tsarevich Dmitry, the last son of Ivan the Terrible, who had died mysteriously in Uglich in 1591. The official story claimed it was an accident, a seizure that caused the boy to stab himself. Few believed it. To the people, Boris was forever tainted, the man who killed a child to take the crown. And then came the famine. From 1601 to 1603, the skies darkened, harvests failed, and hunger spread across the land. Fields lay barren, rivers overflowed, and the people starved. Corpses lined the streets of Moscow. Mothers abandoned children. Entire villages vanished into silence. The people began to murmur. Perhaps this suffering was punishment for Boris's sins. Perhaps God rejected him as Tsar. Into this despair came a whisper. A man appeared, claiming to be Dmitry, the dead son of Ivan the Terrible. He said he had survived the plot to kill him and had returned to claim his rightful throne. The people, desperate for hope, listened. The boyars, eager to weaken Boris, supported him. Poland, ever hungry to influence Russian affairs, gave him backing. This man, remembered as the first false Dmitry, marched on Moscow. Boris tried to rally support, but fate betrayed him. In 1605 he died suddenly, perhaps of illness, perhaps of poison. His son Fifer too succeeded him, but within weeks the boy was murdered. Boris's dynasty ended in blood, as quickly as it had risen. False Dmitry entered Moscow and was crowned. But false Dmitry's reign was short. His Polish allies offended the Russian nobles. His Catholic sympathies angered the Orthodox Church. Rumors of arrogance, of indulgence, spread quickly. Within a year, boyars turned against him. In May 1606, conspirators stormed the Kremlin. The pretender was dragged from his chambers, beaten, stabbed, and shot. His body was burned, his ashes fired from a cannon toward Poland, the land from which he had come. The throne was again empty. Russia fell deeper into chaos. In the years that followed, Russia became a chessboard of power. One czar rose, another fell. Boyars plotted, betrayed, and schemed. Foreign powers intervened, Polish armies marched into Moscow, Swedish armies into Novgorod. Entire regions were controlled by foreign garrisons. New pretenders appeared, the second false Dmitri, the third false Dmitri. Each claimed to be the lost son of Ivan the Terrible. Each gained followers. Each added fuel to the fire. Villages were burned. Cities looted. The countryside bled. The people despaired. It seemed Russia might cease to exist as a nation at all. But from despair rose resistance. In 1612, a militia of nobles, peasants, and merchants gathered under the leadership of Prince Dmitry Pozharsky and the merchant Kuzma Minin. They raised the banner of holy icons, declaring that Russia must be freed from foreign rule and from endless pretenders. The militia marched on Moscow. After a bitter struggle, they drove out the Polish occupiers. The Kremlin was reclaimed. For the first time in years, Moscow was free. Yet the question remained, who would rule? The boyars gathered in 1613 to decide. They were weary of pretenders. They feared more foreign meddling. They needed a czar who was young, untainted, and legitimate enough to be accepted by all. At last, they turned to Mikhail Romanov, a boy only 16 years old, the son of Patriarch Filaret. His youth made him pliable. His bloodline tied him to the old dynasty, and his family was respected by both nobles and commoners. And so, in February 1613, the Zemsky Sobor declared Mikhail Romanov Tsar. It was not a triumph of glory, but of exhaustion. Russia had bled too long. The people desired peace, stability, and continuity. With Mikhail's election, the time of troubles ended. A new dynasty began. When Boris Godunov died in April 1605, the Russian throne, already unstable, was suddenly empty once more. His young son, Fifer II, only 16, inherited the crown. But the boy's reign was measured in weeks, not years. For while Boris's body was still warm in its coffin, a man marched toward Moscow with an army at his back. He called himself Dmitry Ivanovich, son of Ivan the Terrible, thought dead years earlier. The people whispered. Perhaps the rumors were true. Perhaps the Tsarevich had survived the bloody intrigues at Uglich. Perhaps he had returned to claim what was rightfully his. Fifer II tried to hold the throne, but he was isolated. Nobles deserted him. Commoners, starving from famine and weary of Godunov's heavy taxes, turned to the pretender. In June 1605, Fifer and his mother were strangled in Moscow. The boy's body was thrown to the ground. The path was open. The pretender rode in triumph through the Kremlin gates. This man, now remembered as the first false Dmitri, was unlike any Tsar Moscow had ever seen. Tall, charismatic, and eloquent, he dazzled the people with promises of reform and mercy. He pardoned enemies. He distributed gifts. He welcomed foreign ambassadors with warmth. But his charm carried danger. For Dmitri had been raised not in Russia, but in Poland. His manners were foreign. His court was filled with Polish nobles and Catholic priests. The Russian boyars, proud and suspicious, whispered in anger. Could this man truly be the son of Ivan the Terrible? Or was he merely a Polish pawn, a pretender sent to enslave Russia under foreign rule? The church grew uneasy. The common people grew resentful. And the boyars, hungry for power, sharpened their daggers. On May 17, 1606, before dawn, the bells of Moscow tolled not for prayer, but for conspiracy. Armed boyars stormed the Kremlin, swords drawn. Dmitri, startled from his bed, tried to flee. He leapt from a window, breaking his leg, and was dragged into the courtyard. There, in a frenzy, he was beaten, stabbed, and shot. His body was displayed to the people, mocked and desecrated. His ashes were fired from a cannon in the direction of Poland, back to the land many believed had sent him. The boyars declared a new Tsar, Vasily Shuisky, a noble of ancient lineage. But Shuisky's crown was fragile, for the death of one pretender only opened the door for others. In 1607, rumors spread again. A new man appeared, claiming once more to be the miraculously surviving son of Ivan the Terrible. This was the second false Dmitri. He was cruder than the first, less polished, but no less dangerous. Supported by Polish magnates, he gathered a large army and marched on Moscow. For years he fought against Tsar Vasily Shuisky, who proved weak and indecisive. Battles raged across the countryside. Cities burned. Famine and plague followed in their wake. By 1610, Shuisky was overthrown by his own nobles. The throne stood empty again. Moscow descended further into despair. The chaos in Russia was not unnoticed by its neighbors. Poland-Lithuania, powerful and ambitious, saw an opportunity. They sent troops, supporting the pretenders and seizing fortresses. Soon, Polish soldiers occupied the Kremlin itself. The Polish prince, the Ladislaw, was proclaimed Tsar by some boyars. At the same time, Sweden moved into northern Russia, capturing Novgorod and carving out its own sphere of influence. The once mighty Russian state was carved apart, its throne claimed by foreigners, its people ruled by strangers. It seemed the dream of Muscovy might end, devoured by rival powers. As if two impostors were not enough, a third false Dmitri emerged in 1611. This one never even reached Moscow. He gathered some support in the countryside but was captured and executed swiftly. His brief claim revealed the depths of Russia's despair. Anyone, it seemed, could declare himself heir of Ivan the Terrible and find followers. The throne was cursed. Nobles betrayed one another. Cities shifted allegiance like the tides. And the people, beaten down by famine, plague, and foreign soldiers, prayed for salvation. By now, the boyars were hated. Once seen as protectors of the land, they had betrayed their people again and again. They had welcomed foreign soldiers into Moscow. They had murdered tsars, installed pretenders, and grown fat on bribes while peasants starved. The people turned their backs on them. Hope would no longer come from the noble families who schemed in the Kremlin. If salvation came, it would come from elsewhere, from faith, from the common folk, from God himself. And in this despair, seeds of resistance began to grow. By the early 1610s, Russia was on the brink of annihilation. Its throne was empty. Its lands were carved by foreigners. Its nobles were despised. But in the streets, in the fields, and in the churches, whispers spread. Perhaps it was time to rise. Perhaps it was time for Russia itself. Not the boyars, not the Poles, not the Swedes, to choose its destiny. This whisper would soon grow into a roar. It would give birth to a people's militia, and eventually to a new dynasty, the Romanovs. But first came blood. The year was 1611. Moscow, the sacred heart of Russia, groaned beneath the boots of foreign soldiers. The Polish-Lithuanian army, having seized the Kremlin, now ruled the city with arrogance and cruelty. Their banners flew above the towers. Their patrols marched through Red Square. To the people of Moscow, it was as though the Mother of God herself had been taken captive. The streets ran with blood. Churches were looted. Icons were desecrated. Priests were humiliated before their congregations. The once proud capital was a prison, and its jailers spoke a foreign tongue. And yet, beyond Moscow's walls, in towns and villages across the land, a restless anger stirred. In the spring of 1611, the first wave of rebellion broke. A coalition of boyars, nobles, and commoners raised arms against the occupiers. They marched on Moscow, determined to free the city. The battle raged for days. Streets filled with smoke. Wooden houses blazed. The people of Moscow joined in, throwing stones from rooftops, striking at soldiers with knives and axes. But the uprising faltered. Leaders quarreled. The rebels lacked supplies. The Polish garrison held firm behind the Kremlin's thick walls. And so, after weeks of bloodshed, the first rising collapsed. Moscow remained enslaved, yet the fire of resistance had been lit. In the city of Nizhny Novgorod, far from the beaten streets of Moscow, a humble man took the stage. His name was Kuzma Minin, a butcher by trade. He was no noble, no general, no priest. Yet in the crowded marketplace, his voice carried the weight of destiny. He spoke not of personal glory, but of sacrifice. He told the people that Russia itself was dying, that their land had been betrayed by nobles and foreigners alike. If they wished to save their faith, their families, their very souls, they must give everything, wealth, blood, and life itself. Minin's words struck deep. Merchants emptied their coffers. Farmers brought grain. Women sold their jewelry. Even the poorest offered kopecks. Out of the marketplace rose a militia, not of boyars, but of the people. Yet money and faith alone could not lead an army. The people chose a commander, Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a nobleman respected for his bravery and integrity. Though he was of high birth, Pozharsky was unlike the greedy boyars who had betrayed the land. He was humble, pious, and deeply loyal to Russia. When Pozharsky accepted the call, he did so not from a throne but from his sickbed, for he had been wounded in earlier battles. Slowly, painfully, he rose to lead the militia, supported by Minin's unyielding spirit. Together, the butcher and the prince formed a partnership unlike any in Russian history, a union of commoner and noble, of wealth and faith, of sword and spirit. By 1612, the militia was ready. It was not a professional army. Its ranks were filled with peasants, artisans, and priests. They carried farming tools alongside swords, icons alongside spears. Yet their hearts burned with purpose. As they marched toward Moscow, villages and towns opened their gates, offering bread and blessings. Priests walked beside soldiers, carrying relics of saints. Women followed with food and water. It was as though all of Russia moved as one body, bound by faith and desperation. The sight of this army was strange, ragged, and holy, but it was unstoppable. In late August 1612, the People's Army surrounded Moscow. Inside the Kremlin, the Polish garrison held fast, starving but defiant. Outside, Pozharsky and Minin's militia camped in the fields, praying in churches, preparing for the final struggle. The city became a furnace of tension. Skirmishes erupted daily. Supply lines were cut. Winter drew near, and hunger gnawed at all. Yet the people did not break. On October 22nd, after months of siege, the militia stormed the city. Street by street, house by house, they drove back the occupiers. By November 4th, the last Polish soldiers surrendered. Moscow was free. The victory was not won by boyars, nor by foreign allies, but by the will of the people. The names of Minin and Pozharsky shone brighter than any crown. For the first time in years, the bells of Moscow rang in joy. Priests carried icons through the streets. Men wept openly. Women knelt on the cobblestones. Russia had nearly been consumed by chaos, famine, and foreign rule. Yet from the hearts of its common people salvation had come. But though Moscow was free, the throne still stood empty. Who would wear the crown? That question lingered, and it would soon lead to the rise of a new dynasty, the Romanovs. Though Moscow was free in November 1612, the land was far from healed. The city lay in ruins. Many of its churches were burned, its markets destroyed, its people scarred by hunger and grief. The countryside, too, had been ravaged. Villages burned in raids, fields left untended, rivers clogged with unburied dead. The time of troubles had lasted nearly 2 decades. Russia had been torn apart by famine, impostors, foreign armies, and betrayals from its own nobility. And now, even with the Poles driven out, one terrible truth remained. Russia had no Tsar. The throne of Ivan the Terrible's dynasty stood empty, and in that emptiness, ambition stirred like a serpent. The boyars, those ancient nobles who claimed descent from the earliest Rus princes, gathered in secrecy. They knew that the people despised them. For years they had betrayed one another, shifted loyalties between false tsars, and even invited foreign rulers into the Kremlin. Now, with the people rising in strength under Minin and Pozharsky, the boyars feared that their power might vanish. They needed a czar, but one weak enough to be controlled, young enough to be molded, yet legitimate enough to satisfy the people's hunger for stability. Every noble family saw itself as the rightful heir. And so, the court became a battlefield of whispers and poisoned cups. Beyond Russia's borders, powerful kings watched eagerly. The king of Poland dreamed of placing his son on Moscow's throne, turning Russia into a satellite of the Polish crown. The king of Sweden plotted the same, offering princes of his own dynasty. Even the Pope in Rome cast his eyes eastward, hoping to pull Orthodox Russia into the embrace of Catholic Europe. Foreign ambassadors crowded Moscow, carrying bribes and promises. Some whispered of peace, others threatened more war. But to the Russian people, such talk was treason. They had bled and starved too long to place a foreigner on the sacred throne of the Tsars. In early 1613, a great council was called the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land. From every corner of Russia, delegates came. Boyars and nobles, merchants and clergy, even peasants. They gathered in Moscow, in the shadow of the ruined Kremlin, to decide the future of the realm. It was a scene unlike any before. Bearded peasants in sheepskin coats stood beside velvet-robed princes. Monks in black robes prayed beside merchants clutching ledgers. All had come to choose not merely a ruler, but a savior. The debate raged for weeks. Names were shouted, dismissed, reconsidered. Some called for a nobleman. Others demanded a foreign prince. But a strange unity began to form, not around power, but around survival. Outside the council hall, the streets buzzed with rumor. Crowds gathered, waiting for news. But the people were not silent. They shouted their own demands. No foreign czar. No trater boyar. We want a true son of Russia. The name that began to echo was unexpected. Mikhail Romanov. He was only 16 years old, a boy living with his mother, the nun Martha, in the remote Ipatiev monastery. His family had suffered during the time of troubles. His father, once a boyar, had been imprisoned and tortured by enemies. The Romanovs were neither the most powerful nor the most ambitious, and that precisely was their strength. Mikhail was seen as pure, untouched by betrayal, a vessel of hope for a weary land. On February 21, 1613, the decision was made. The Zemsky Sobor, after endless debate, chose Mikhail Romanov as Tsar of Russia. Bells rang from every church tower. Priests carried icons through the streets. The people wept with relief. The boyars, though uneasy, bowed to the will of the land. Foreign ambassadors fumed, their schemes undone. But one question remained. Would the boy himself accept the crown? For when word reached the monastery, Mikhail and his mother hesitated. They feared the burden, the danger, the certainty that enemies would rise again. Thus, in the ashes of war and betrayal, a fragile choice had been made. The boyars had gambled on a youth they thought pliable. The people had cried for a ruler untainted by treachery. The clergy had blessed a dynasty they believed chosen by God. The throne, empty for too long, now awaited its new occupant. And though Mikhail Romanov was far away, trembling at the thought of rule, history had already placed the crown upon his head. Soon the weary land would rise again, not into peace, but into the shadow of a dynasty that would rule for the next 300 years. Far from Moscow's smoldering ruins, in the quiet town of Kostroma, winter lay heavy on the land. Snow blanketed the forests. Rivers froze into silence. The wooden domes of the Ipatiev monastery rose like pale ghosts against the sky. Here lived Mikhail Romanov, only 16 years of age, with his widowed mother, Marfa Romanova, who had taken holy vows after her husband's death. Their life was modest, almost cloistered. While boyars in Moscow schemed for crowns and armies, Mikhail and his mother prayed in the candlelit chapel, tended gardens, and endured the cold in thick sheepskin. The monastery seemed a world apart from the chaos of the time of troubles. But destiny had already set its eyes upon the boy within. In February 1613, the silence of Kostroma was broken by the thunder of hooves. Through snow and wind rode a delegation from Moscow, wrapped in fur cloaks, their horses steaming in the frost. Their arrival startled the monks, who rushed to open the gates. Behind them, peasants gathered, whispering rumors. When the delegation entered, they knelt before the boy Mikhail. With solemn voices, they declared, "By the will of God, by the blessing of the Church, and by the cry of the people, you, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov, are chosen as Tsar of all Russia." The monastery fell silent. Monks crossed themselves. Peasants gasped. Mikhail himself trembled. But it was Marfa Romanova who spoke first. Her face, lined with sorrow and wisdom, darkened with fear. She had lived through betrayals, wars, and the murder of her kin. She knew what it meant to wear the crown of Russia. It was not an honor, but a curse. "My son is but a child," she told the envoys, her voice sharp. He is weak in body, unlearned in rule, untested in war. The throne is made of thorns. Do not drag him to destruction. Tears filled her eyes as she pleaded. She had already lost her husband to the cruelty of the boyars. She did not wish to lose her son to the same fate. Mikhail, pale and silent, clutched the cross at his neck, torn between duty and terror. For hours, Mikhail remained silent. He wept. He protested. He begged his mother not to let them take him. He feared Moscow, a city of blood and betrayal. He feared the boyars who had murdered kings before him. He feared the weight of the crown that had crushed even mighty rulers like Ivan the Terrible. I do not want it, he whispered to the monks. I am not strong enough. I cannot bear it. The envoys, moved by his tears, swore that he would not be alone. They promised him the loyalty of Minin and Pozharsky, the protection of the church, and the prayers of all Russia. Still, the boy hesitated. At last, the patriarch's envoys brought forth icons and relics. They held before Mikhail the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, the most sacred image in Russia. This is not your choice, child, one priest declared. It is God's will. The land cannot survive without a Tsar. You were chosen, not by men, but by heaven itself. The monks echoed the words, chanting prayers. Outside, peasants cried his name. His mother, still trembling, realized the tide could not be turned. Mikhail bowed his head. Slowly, with trembling hands, he kissed the icon. In that moment, his fate was sealed. Word spread quickly. The boy had accepted. The people rejoiced.
Bells rang in Kostroma.
Peasants knelt in the snow, thanking God. The envoys wept with relief. But inside the monastery, Mikhail's heart remained heavy. He knew he was stepping into a world of daggers and shadows. Yet he also felt a strange fire stir within him, the fire of duty, the whisper of destiny. For better or worse, he would be Tsar. The boy who once tended gardens and prayed in silence would now sit upon Russia's throne. The reluctant child would become the first ruler of the Romanov Dynasty, which would reign for the next 3 centuries. With his acceptance, preparations began for the long journey to Moscow. Priests blessed his path. Soldiers gathered to escort him. Villagers lined the roads, bringing bread and salt, symbols of welcome and loyalty. Marfa walked beside him, still fearful, but resigned. She whispered prayers with every step, asking God to protect her son. And though the boy was reluctant, each mile toward Moscow hardened him. By the time the golden domes of the Kremlin rose before him, Mikhail was no longer merely a boy. He was the chosen Tsar, reluctant yet anointed. In early 1613, after weeks of deliberation inside the walls of the Ipatov monastery, the Boyar Council and church leaders declared Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar of Russia. Yet he was still far from Moscow. He was still a boy living in Kostroma with his mother, the nun Marfa, unaware of the great burden about to fall upon his shoulders. Messengers rode for days through the snow, carrying the decree of the Zemsky Sobor, the National Assembly of Russia. The news spread like wildfire. A new Tsar had been chosen. Villages rang bells, priests led prayers, and soldiers swore oaths of loyalty to a name most had never heard spoken with such reverence. But as the boy and his mother were escorted toward Moscow, whispers surrounded them. Was he too young? too inexperienced, too soft for the throne of a land that devoured even its strongest rulers? Each mile closer to the Kremlin carried with it not only the sound of cheering peasants but also the heavy silence of expectation. Inside the Kremlin, Moscow was alive with frantic preparations. The city that had seen fires, invasions, and uprisings now stood ready to host a coronation that symbolized rebirth. Carpenters worked day and night repairing the battered cathedrals. Painters gilded icons, polishing halos of saints until they glowed like fire. Tailors stitched ceremonial robes from gold and velvet, while jewelers prepared the treasures that had survived the turmoil. At the heart of it all lay the Cathedral of the Dormition, the ancient church of coronations. Its white stone walls had echoed with the chants of countless ceremonies, but never before had a boy so young ascended to the throne. Patriarch Filaret, who had guided the church through chaos, stood ready to crown the child Tsar. Every detail carried weight. The sacred oil, the crown of monomach, the orb, and the scepter. Each symbol was meant to remind both ruler and ruled that kingship was not merely power. It was divine responsibility. On a cold spring morning in 1613, the Kremlin bells thundered across Moscow. Crowds flooded Red Square, pressing against the wooden barriers, their breath visible in the frosty air. The sound of drums and trumpets pierced the silence as Mikhail entered the city gates. He wore robes far too heavy for his frail shoulders, embroidered with golden patterns of eagles and crosses. His eyes were wide, uncertain, almost afraid, as he gazed upon the sea of people who cheered his name. Behind him walked his mother, Marfa, her black nun's robes stark against the splendor of the procession. The boy trembled, but he pressed forward, clutching a golden cross handed to him by a priest. His steps echoed like thunder against the cobblestones, a reminder that history itself was walking beside him. As Mikhail entered the Cathedral of the Dormition, silence fell. Only the chants of monks filled the air, deep voices resonating like the heartbeat of the nation. The boy knelt before the altar, the golden light of candles bathing his face. The patriarch approached with the sacred oil, dipping his fingers into the chrism that symbolized divine blessing. As the oil was traced upon his forehead, shoulders, and chest, Mikhail closed his eyes. In that moment, the boy was no longer a mere child. He was the living embodiment of the Russian state, chosen not by his will but by the will of God and the people. The crown of monomach, heavy with jewels, was placed upon his head. The orb and scepter followed, symbols of earthly and spiritual authority. The weight of it all nearly crushed him. His hands shook as he held them, but the crowd erupted in chants of Nagaya Lita, long life to the Tsar. After the coronation, the Kremlin erupted into celebration. Bells rang across Moscow, their sound rolling like thunder across the city walls. Feasts were laid out in long wooden halls. Roasted meats, honey cakes, and barrels of mead. Nobles in fur-lined cloaks raised goblets and toasts, while peasants outside lit bonfires and sang folk songs late into the night. For a brief moment, the wounds of the time of troubles were forgotten. The people laughed, wept, and embraced one another as if to reassure themselves that peace had finally returned. Even skeptics among the boyars, who doubted the youth of the new Tsar, found themselves carried by the wave of hope. Yet beneath the laughter lingered a quiet truth. This boy, fragile and untested, would need to guide Russia through storms yet to come. the crown was only the beginning. The burden of kingship would either shape him or destroy him. And so, in 1613, a 16-year-old boy crowned in trembling hands became Tsar Mikhail I of Russia, the first ruler of the Romanov dynasty. His reign would not be one of instant glory, but of endurance, compromise, and survival. Yet from his hesitant coronation grew a dynasty that would shape Russia for more than 300 years. In the silence of the cathedral, as the crown pressed into his brow, perhaps the boy did not yet know it, but history did, and history had just begun to carve the name Romanov into eternity.